Hello everyone and welcome back to Comparison World Facts. Today we will look closely into the real reason why Africa is still poor. Keep watching for everything you need to know. Firstly, how does the West perceive Africa? Westerners' perception of Africa is often one of poverty and unending war. The continent is a land perpetually locked in conflict, so many continue to view it as an untapped market ripe for investment. But this image of a war-torn, underdeveloped continent is far from the truth. Africa has overcome much in its journey towards self-reliance, economic development, and social progress. However, not enough attention has been given to the underlying factors that have kept the vast majority of Africans impoverished. These factors are structural, rooted in certain countries' histories and cultures that has led to an inability to create long-term prosperity for their people. That being said, there are ways in which Africa can become more financially independent and improve the quality of life for all its people. In this video, we will explore many reasons why Africa remains poor. Sub-Saharan Africa hasn't had the easiest time over the past few hundred years. The region has been grappling with several challenges, including a lack of economic growth. While some countries have experienced a positive change in recent years, others have not. As a result, Africa is home to some of the world's poorest nations, primarily because they lack the necessary tools and resources to build their economies and progress. But why? Keep watching closely to find out everything you need to know. Up next, how many people in Africa are suffering from poverty? There are now 282 million Africans suffering from hunger, an increase of 80 million people since 2014. According to the World Data Lab, 42 African countries are in poverty, and in 16 of these countries, the incidence of poverty is rising. Sub-Saharan Africa accounts for 27 of the world's 28 poorest nations. Each of these 27 nations has a poverty rate of over 30%. Even though global poverty has decreased over the last several decades, Sub-Saharan Africa's number has increased considerably. So how is poverty measured in Africa? The World Bank uses non-income dimensions of poverty to assess education, health, access to social services, and other factors. In addition to economic definitions, these indicators also consider as social exclusion and social capital. Poverty is usually measured using the World Bank's $1.90 per day. The World Bank recognizes that poverty is not just hunger, unhygienic living conditions, not having access to education, not being able to read, not having a job, worrying about the future, having a child stricken with illness that can be cured, and living one day at a time. The World Bank has developed indicators to assess the non-income dimensions of poverty beyond economic deprivation. These indicators include education, health, access to social services, vulnerability, social exclusion, and access to social capital. Up next, how does the lack of shelter affect Africans? The lack of shelter is intricately linked to the factors mentioned earlier. It is essential to recognize that the poor do have some type of shelter. It's just the lack of access to basic needs such as water, sanitation, and electricity. For example, a family might live in a mud shack without any light or cool air conditioning source. There might be animals and children sharing a small space. The people of this family are poor and could not be lacking in any other way, but the sad thing is, there's almost nothing they can do about it. Lack of shelter affects an insane amount of Africans, with an estimated 80 million African children lacking healthy shelter and another 16 million that are forced to live on the streets. So, how many Africans have limited access to clean water and food? Water is a necessary resource for all living things. However, people living in developing countries have a much harder time accessing clean water. This is important because water is essential to food, health, hygiene, and sanitation, according to the United Nations. Lack of access to clean water resources is a significant factor in Africa's persistent poverty. Many people in certain areas do not have access to safe drinking water. This means people are forced to drink contaminated water, which can lead to diseases. On top of this, many people living in developing countries have limited access to food. This is commonly referred to as food insecurity or food insecurity and malnutrition. This can be a life-threatening situation for people who do not have access to food. In some countries, up to 40% of the population may suffer from food insecurity, with a total estimate of roughly 350 million Africans facing food insecurity. Up next, what else do Africans lack access to? Healthcare is also something that many people living in developing countries struggle with. This can include access to basic healthcare as well as treatment for diseases. In some countries, people have limited access to both types of healthcare. For example, there may be few clinics or hospitals. In other areas, people have no access to any healthcare whatsoever due to the high cost of treatment. Only about 1/2 of Africa's population has access to healthcare. In addition to the factors we mentioned earlier, Africa's persistent poverty can be attributed to the limited and dwindling natural resources. For example, there may be shortages of fresh water or a lack of arable land. Of course, these are not the only factors that have led to African poverty, but they are some of the most prominent. Understanding these factors will help you to better understand why Africa is still poor. So, how is underdeveloped infrastructure affecting the continent? It is a widespread notion that the African continent suffers from persistent poverty. However, the reality is much different. Africa has many natural resources, but its poor economic policies have left it in perpetual poverty. Unfortunately, this has led to the underdevelopment of many other countries with similar advantages. To understand why this is so, let's take a closer look at some factors that have kept Africa in poverty for so long. Infrastructure is one of the most critical factors determining any country's economic development. A country with an underdeveloped infrastructure can never hope to achieve a high standard of living, as it will fail to attract the right kinds of businesses and create jobs for its people. In the case of Africa, the lack of a robust transportation system has resulted in the continent being extremely dependent on imports. This has led to the continent being extremely vulnerable to changes in the international economy. Furthermore, the lack of an essential transportation system has also meant a massive imbalance between the coastal and interior regions of the continent. As a result, the economy of the interior has not been able to benefit from the bulk of the continent's natural resources. The manufacturing sector is one of the cornerstones of any economic development strategy. A weak manufacturing base is a surefire way of keeping a country in perpetual poverty. Africa has a large number of natural resources, which, if corralled and efficiently utilized, could have resulted in a solid manufacturing base, which would have helped the continent achieve a much higher standard of living. Unfortunately, the lack of policies and investment to develop this sector has made the continent extremely poor. However, the lack of any solid manufacturing base has meant that these countries have entirely depended on imports. Consequently, when there has been a change in the international economy, this has led to considerable fluctuations in the foreign exchange rates, making these countries extremely vulnerable. Up next, how does high volatility in commodity prices affect the economy? The commodity markets in Africa are very volatile, which makes them a hazardous investment option. This has made them a favorite method for many African governments to raise additional revenue. Unfortunately, these high levels of volatility make them a dangerous investment option, which means they are not suitable for most people. This has resulted in most of the population staying entirely away from the commodity markets, which has only worsened the situation. The price fluctuations in such volatile commodities such as oil, gold, and even agricultural products like coffee have an enormous impact on the economies of many African countries. This is because a large part of the revenue generated by many countries in the continent comes from selling these commodities. As a result, a sudden decline in the prices of these commodities can lead to a complete economic meltdown. The legal framework is another factor that has significantly contributed to the ongoing poverty in Africa. The legal framework is essential in a country that experiences the influx of a large number of investors. Investors are utterly wary of investing their money in a country with an inadequate legal framework. This is because they're always worried about the legal status of their money. However, investors are much more comfortable investing their money in a country with an adequate legal framework. So, why is there less development spending? Many people assume that Africa is poor because it has not spent enough money on development. The unfortunate truth, however, is that the continent's standard of living has been kept at a very low level because of poor economic policies. The belief that developing countries should spend more money on development has failed some countries and left the continent with a very low level of economic growth. The continent has been spending a minimal share of its income on development, particularly on areas such as agriculture and healthcare. This has resulted in a large number of people dying unattended. This has resulted in Africa staying poor. The development spending in Africa has badly neglected areas such as education, infrastructure, healthcare, and agriculture. As a result, these sectors have remained extremely poor and cannot contribute to the continent's overall development. On top of this, the policy of financial inclusion has been grossly neglected in many African countries. This means that most of the population is completely excluded from the financial sector. This results in the huge majority of the population staying completely away from the sources of regular income. The lack of financial inclusion in many African countries is particularly unfortunate, as these countries have a large amount of natural resources. Up next, how is there a serious lack of infrastructure? The policy of investing in infrastructure has been grossly neglected in many African countries. This means that a large majority of the people are not getting proper access to essential services such as clean water and electricity. The lack of adequate infrastructure investment has resulted in many natural resources lying in their natural states, such as unutilized land and minerals lying in the ground. This has resulted in a significant drop in the value of these resources. The lack of proper investment in the infrastructure sector has also led to a large number of natural resources such as agricultural land lying fallow, minerals lying in the ground, and water lying in reservoirs. This has left many of the continent's people unserved and without proper access to essential services. You cannot have a thriving economy without natural resources. However, these resources are not sufficient on their own. To prosper, a country needs strong institutions and a conducive political environment. Unfortunately, such conditions are rarely found in African countries. Most of the resource-rich countries in the continent face serious natural resource disputes. For example, Nigeria, Angola, and Equatorial Guinea are among the regions that have had socio-political conflicts over natural resources. In addition, several countries are experiencing severe environmental issues. Some of these problems include the high rate of deforestation, desertification, and pollution from mining activities. These problems stem from policies and how governments choose to use their natural resources. Unfortunately, economic policies have been unwise in many resource-rich African countries. Such bad policies have resulted in several economic ills. Many African countries have failed to adopt a coherent economic development strategy. In addition, they have also neglected trade liberalization and privatization. Such bad economic policies have led to meager growth rates, high inflation, and a considerable trade deficit. The current economic crisis has also severely affected the financial performance of resource-rich African countries. As the crisis deepens, these countries will find it even harder to overcome their poor economic policies. Why else is there a lack of institutional development? Institutional development is the process through which a government builds strong institutions. Strong institutions are essential for a booming economy. They help improve the delivery of public services, fight corruption, curb crime, and enforce the rule of law. The resources of an economy play a very important role in institutional development. They help in building strong institutions. Resources such as human capital, natural resources, and technology are significant for institutional development. Unfortunately, African countries have been very slow in developing their human resources and utilizing their natural resources. Due to their underdeveloped institutions, resource-rich African countries have experienced many economic problems. The lack of institutional development has hindered economic growth in trade and investment, and the transformation of their economies into markets. So, why are there inequalities and a lack of equal opportunities? One of the significant factors that have contributed to the poor economic performance of Africa is the unequal distribution of natural resources. Many resource-rich countries have failed to provide their people with equal opportunities. This is simple. Some people are more powerful than others. In most resource-rich African countries, the rich have become richer while the poor have remained poor. At the same time, the middle class is shrinking. This has resulted in a large number of people who are frustrated, angry, and feeling hopeless. The inequalities in Africa go beyond financial wealth. In many countries, women feel less equal than men. The incidence of gender-based violence is also high. Next up, how has bilateral aid and foreign exchange scandals caused poor economic performance? African countries have received a lot of foreign aid. However, the amount is not sufficient to help the continent develop. Unfortunately, the assistance has often ended up in scandals. For example, in the 1990s, many African countries used aid and money to buy oil from the former Soviet Union. Also, some of the money was then shipped out of the continent and used to purchase luxury items from abroad. Such aid scandals have also left many African countries with substantial foreign exchange debts. However, due to their poor economic policies, these countries have been unable to generate much foreign exchange. Therefore, when the aid is withdrawn, the recipient countries will be in a bad situation. Bilateral aid has also resulted in poor economic performance. For example, some aid partners have encouraged the adoption of bad economic policies by the recipient countries. So, why do many African countries have weak ties with international trade partners? The resource-rich African countries have not been able to develop strong ties with international trade partners. For example, most countries in the continent export raw materials such as crude oil, coal, iron ore, bauxite, and manganese. To export these goods, they must engage in mining activities. However, mining is a non-profitable industry. To make it profitable, the mining companies receive subsidies from the government. This has led to poor economic performance in many African countries. The weak trade linkages and resource-rich countries have also disadvantaged them in their current financial crisis. Due to their poor trade performance, these countries have been hit by the current economic crisis. One of the crucial factors that has kept Africa in perpetual poverty is a small population base with lower per capita income. The continent's population of 1.2 billion people is only about 1/5 of the world's population of 7 billion people. Due to the small population base and low per capita income, these countries have been unable to generate enough wealth to progress significantly. This has also prevented them from gaining access to new technologies and trade partners. Lastly, why does Africa have a poor educational system and lack technological advancement? The poor economic performance of the African countries have been caused by the poor educational system and the lack of technological advancement. The educational system in these countries has been inferior to the rest of the world. As a result, the job market has been full of graduates with no job prospects. The educational system in these countries has also been very discriminatory. For example, you needed to belong to a particular caste or tribe to get a government job. Such practices have also made it difficult for these people to gain university admission. Due to these reasons, most people in the job market are unskilled and uneducated. In several countries, the educational system has remained unchanged for decades. This has resulted in a large number of people without access to education. Due to their low education levels, these people have also been left at a disadvantage in the job market. So there you have it, everything you need to know about why Africa is still poor. Do you think you'll ever travel to any of these African countries? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content just like this. Also, comment your thoughts on our comparison.